Picture this. It's 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, is at the absolute peak of his power. He puts together the biggest army the continent has ever seen and points it east, thinking this is the last move he needs to make to lock down his empire for good. But you see, this wasn't just another war. This was an all-or-nothing gamble for total control, a clash of giants that would become this incredible story of hubris, of suffering on a scale you can't even imagine, and the one single campaign that would ultimately seal his fate. So, to really get our heads around this disaster, we're going to trace the whole thing from start to finish. We'll start with Napoleon's massive ambitions. Then we'll follow his Grande Armée deep into Russia. We'll stand on the battlefield of Borodino, walk through the ashes of Moscow, and then we'll watch as the whole imperial dream just comes apart at the seams. Okay, so to understand why he did it, we have to rewind a bit. At this point, Napoleon isn't just a general. He's the emperor. He's a certified military genius who has literally redrawn the map of Europe. But that just wasn't enough for him. His ambition was aiming even higher. And right from the get-go, you can see how Napoleon is spinning this. This isn't just an invasion. He's selling it as a legendary quest. He's promising his soldiers that they'll be part of history, that they'll have this incredible story to tell their grandkids. This was meant to be a new chapter in his own personal epic. And you can see why he was so confident. Just look at this map. His empire stretched from Spain all the way to Poland. I mean, he was the undisputed master of the continent. But there was always a but, wasn't there? One power that just wouldn't bend the knee, a problem he couldn't seem to solve: Great Britain. So here's the thing. He couldn't just invade Britain. Their Royal Navy made that pretty much impossible. So his solution? Economic warfare. He created something called the Continental System, which was basically a giant Europe-wide blockade designed to starve Britain's economy. But for a plan like that to work, everybody had to be on board. And Tsar Alexander I of Russia, he was openly breaking the rules. For Napoleon, that was a direct challenge. He felt he had to make an example out of Russia to finally force Britain's hand. And so, in June of 1812, it began. The Grande Armée, a massive multinational force of more than 500,000 men, poured across the Niemen River into Russia. Napoleon thought it would be quick. Find the Russian army, smash it in one big, glorious battle, and force the Tsar to the negotiating table. Simple, right? Well, the Russians had a very different idea. Instead of giving Napoleon that glorious battle he wanted, they just backed up. They retreated deeper and deeper into the endless Russian landscape, and as they went, they burned everything. Villages, crops, they even poisoned wells. They were turning Russia's biggest weakness, its immense size, into their most powerful weapon. They were stretching Napoleon's supply lines like a rubber band, just waiting for them to snap. For weeks, the French army felt like it was chasing ghosts. Then, finally, on September 7th, just 70 miles short of Moscow, the Russian army, led by General Kutuzov, turned around and prepared to fight. The battle that erupted there, Borodino, was everything Napoleon wanted, and so much more than he could have ever imagined. It would go down in history as the single bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. From the very first moment, it was just pure butchery. The French threw wave after wave of men at these massive earthen forts, they called them redoubts, straight into a wall of cannon fire. Just listen to this account from Colonel Paulet-Clouzot. The French high command was being torn apart almost instantly. The cost was unbelievable, and the battle had barely even started. But for every bit of ground the French took, the Russians came roaring back with a furious counterattack. General Paskevich describes this just tide of violence, this desperate fight where the same patches of ground were taken, lost, and retaken over literal piles of bodies. This wasn't some elegant battle of maneuvers. It was a human meat grinder. Then came the critical moment. The Russian line was starting to break. Napoleon's generals were begging him, pleading with him to send in his last reserve, the elite Imperial Guard, to land the killer blow. And Napoleon hesitated. He held them back. This drove his commanders insane. You can just feel the rage in Marshal Ney's voice. They felt like victory was right there, and the emperor was letting it slip away because he lost his nerve. And the result of that hesitation? Take a look at this number. 70,000. In about 12 hours of fighting, 70,000 men were killed or wounded. I mean, let that sink in. The French technically won the field, but they hadn't destroyed the Russian army. It was a victory, but one that had bled his own army almost to death. A week after the absolute horror of Borodino, Napoleon finally marched into Moscow. This was supposed to be it, right? The grand price. He expected a delegation of city leaders to greet him, to hand over the keys to the city, to sue for peace. But instead, what he found was an eerie, deathly silence. The city was a ghost town. Almost the entire population, nearly 300,000 people, had just up and left with the retreating army. The streets were empty. The great prize he'd sacrificed tens of thousands of men for was completely hollow. That decisive moment, that political checkmate he needed, it just never happened. And then the city started to burn. The Russians themselves, in a final unbelievable act of defiance, had set fire to their own holy city. Napoleon could only stand and watch in absolute disbelief, saying they weren't modern people, they were Scythians, ancient warriors from the steppes. He just couldn't comprehend it. So you can see how this perfect trap just snapped shut around him. The city is empty. The fire destroys what little food and shelter was left. He keeps sending peace offers to the Tsar, and all he gets back is silence. And all the while, winter is coming. The first snowflakes are starting to fall. This was the unsolvable problem he was facing. In every other campaign, taking the enemy's capital city meant game over. But here, sitting in a smoldering ruin hundreds of miles deep in enemy territory, the old rules just didn't apply. Victory was meaningless. So on October 19th, after 5 long weeks of waiting for a surrender that was never going to come, Napoleon finally gave the order. The Grande Armée abandoned Moscow and started the long, long march home. This journey would become one of the most horrifying disasters in the history of warfare. You see, there wasn't one big final battle. The army just disintegrated. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. Constant hit-and-run attacks from Cossacks, the soul-crushing cold of the Russian winter, and worst of all, starvation. The proud soldiers who marched into Russia turned into a frozen, starving mob. And here's the really important part. What happened in Russia, it wasn't just a military failure. It exposed a fundamental truth about Napoleon's entire empire. The whole system was stretched to its absolute breaking point. And to see that, you just have to look thousands of miles away, at a supposedly stable border like the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. Even here, in his own backyard, the French government was struggling to enforce its will. Yet smugglers, rebels, people with their own local loyalties, who just refused to play by Paris's rules. It showed that Napoleon's absolute control was really more of an illusion. And that's what the disaster in Russia really laid bare. On one hand, you have Napoleon's grand vision, this perfectly organized, centrally controlled continent. And on the other, you have the messy, chaotic reality of trying to rule over millions of people who didn't want to be ruled. The empire was just too big, stretched way too thin. And if you want to understand the scale of it, just look at these numbers. More than 500,000 soldiers marched into Russia. Fewer than 100,000 staggered back out. This wasn't a defeat, it was an annihilation. He didn't just lose a campaign, he lost the very heart of his army. And with it, he lost the aura of invincibility that held his whole empire together. You know, Napoleon was the undisputed master of the big, decisive battle. He knew how to win. But the Russians beat him by refusing to play his game. They didn't outfight him, they outlasted him, they endured. And in doing that, they posed a question that still echoes today. What if real power isn't about winning the battle, but about having the sheer will to endure the storm, no matter how terrible the cost?